Good evening, everybody. And if it's not too late already in the year for that sort of thing, very happy New Year to you. So it's a great pleasure to welcome our speaker for this evening, Erich Matthes, who is an associate professor, at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. Before that, he did a PhD at Berkeley. And he is an expert on the ethics, politics, and aesthetics of cultural heritage, art, and the environment. He's written 2 books. The first is called Drawing the Line: What to Do with Immoral Artists from Museums to the Movies, which came out in 2022. And his new book, which some of you will have seen outside, it was published in America in October and it's coming out in the UK in a week's time, is called What to Save and What and Why. And a reviewer of that book said, as we prepare to tackle our national attics, we are lucky to have Matthes as a guide. We're very lucky to have him with us this evening. Erich, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks everybody so much for being here. It's a pleasure to be with you. Like Ed said, and thank you, Ed, I'm going to discuss some themes from my new book, What to Save and Why, which conveniently will be published 1 week from today in the UK. And it occurred to me that some of you who are here tonight might be very familiar with philosophy as a discipline, but others might have been drawn to the topic of conservation and might not be familiar with philosophy at all. So I thought I would start with the simple task of just telling you what philosophy is. That was a joke. One of my favorite quotes about philosophy, it's trotted out a lot, comes from Wilfrid Sellars. So he famously wrote, quote, that the aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. So I've always really liked that way of characterizing philosophy, and independently of its merits as a definition of philosophy, it is very good at characterizing the nature of this particular book. So what I was really trying to do with this book is think really broadly about the nature of conservation across a really wide array of contexts and see what kinds of lessons we could draw from that kind of 30,000-foot view on conservation. So there's lots of scholarship on conservation, of course, lots of practitioners of conservation, and it's often very, very narrow, right? Because there's a lot of expertise that can be involved working on the conservation of some particular thing, right? Some particular kind of artwork, some particular kind of environment. So I wanted to try to zoom out, and I think that's often what philosophy can best do in sort of lending itself to public understanding, is to sort of take that big picture view and sort of see how some of the pieces fit together. So that's really sort of the spirit in which I approached this project. So, that's the book. So I want to begin today by priming your thinking about the relationship between conservation and memory. So when I say conservation here, I just mean saving things, which can sometimes involve that kind of technical work that I was mentioning that we often associate with the term conservation. But it can also involve the quotidian tasks involved in simply preventing things from being discarded or destroyed. So among the many reasons we save things is so that they are not forgotten. Consider this passage from Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. So the Joad family in The Grapes of Wrath are forced to flee their home due to a combination of environmental and economic hardship, and they're faced with this harrowing task of determining what they can save. Right? So here's the passage. The women sat among the doomed things, turning them over and looking past them and back. This book, my father had it. He liked a book, Pilgrim's Progress, used to read it, got his name in it, and his pipe still smells rank, and this picture, an angel. I looked at that before the first 3 come. Didn't seem to do much good. Think we could get this China dog in? Aunt Sadie brought it from the St. Louis Fair. See? Wrote right on it. No, I guess not. Here's a letter my brother wrote the day before he died. Here's an old-time hat. These feathers, never got to use them. No, there isn't room. How can we live without our lives? How will we know it's us without our past? So here we see illustrated the idea not only that we save things so they're not forgotten, but that we save them so that we are not forgotten. The transition from this list of mundane household objects can be jarring, right? You go from here's an old hat to how do we live without our lives? But I think what makes this passage so profound and moving is that it gets at something deep about the connection between saving things and saving ourselves. Who we are is defined in part by the things that we think are worth caring for, and whether we care for these things in turn shapes our sense of self. So think about someone who's an environmentalist, any environmentalist. An essential part of what it is to be an environmentalist is to care about and care for our environment in some way. If someone who claimed to identify as environmentalist couldn't be bothered to do anything for environmental causes, then their identity as an environmentalist would plausibly be threatened. And I'm not just talking about the idea that some third party might accuse them of hypocrisy. I mean that they themselves, from their own subjective perspective, would rightly ask, wait, who am I? So the things that we think are worth conserving, worth saving, play an important role in defining our identity. And this is in part why we can make sense of the idea that saving things that matter to us is always in part an endeavor to save our sense of self. But save it from what? That's the question that I'm largely going to focus on today. It's often easy to assume that when we're invested in saving something, that we want to save it from loss, right? From destruction, from change, from being forgotten, and so on. But conservation across many fields and disciplines has wisely reframed the idea that conservation is just concerned with arresting change or preventing loss by reconstruing it as fundamentally about the management of change, right? So not just prevention of change, but managing change. So people who maybe are here from a conservation field, this will be really familiar. Right? This framing focuses our attention on understanding the very nature of change and its significance to the conservation of things. What makes a change count as something to be prevented or deterred rather than a change that's welcomed or celebrated. When we identify a thing as changing, the very terms we use to classify that change conjure an understanding of the change's source and ultimately its meaning. As the philosopher Caroline Korsmeyer frames the idea, in short, cause is embedded in the very concepts of damage, deterioration, and degradation, which situate objects in relation to a set of external events. To use these concepts commands that what we might term a particularly deep narrative aura, for it summons a story accounting for the damaged condition. Damage might be caused by environmental conditions or a careless visitor at an art gallery, but to identify change as damage is to, by that stroke, invoke a general sense of the kind of change, the kind of cause driving the change, as well as implications about how we're supposed to feel about that kind of change. Right? When you eat a sandwich, even though it's undergone a substantial change, you don't typically say that you damaged it, unless you're speaking hyperbolically, as in, like, dude, I totally destroyed that sandwich. That might be something that only Americans say. Likewise, there's damage involved in surgery, and there's damage involved in home renovation, but it's not typically the concept that we appeal to in describing these changes because it evokes the wrong kind of narrative aura, right? It doesn't summon the right story about the kind of change that's occurring. So the idea that change is granted a certain character by the story it conjures points towards a role for us to play in shaping the nature of change as well. Part of this narrative aura that Korsmeyer invokes comes not only from the cause or source of change, but also from the terms on which a potential change is confronted, managed, accepted, rejected, and so on. In other words, how we encounter change ends up shaping the significance and nature of the change itself. This is why the terms on which we face change, and in particular the agency that we exercise in doing so, are crucial to our understanding of that change's meaning, and so in turn, the role it should play in our lives. So I want you to consider this idea about the terms on which we experience change in relation to the practice of collecting. I want to talk about this quote by Questlove. You might know Questlove as the drummer for The Roots. He's also a filmmaker and a really great writer, and this comes from this lovely essay that he published about collecting in the New York Times a couple of years ago. So he writes, "A collection starts as a protest against the passage of time and ends as a celebration of it." A collection starts as a protest against the passage of time and ends as a celebration of it. One way to understand the process at play in this remark is that collecting involves changing the terms on which the passage of time is experienced. Trends and fashions change, and you collect to hold on to the marvels of a moment that's passing by. Clinging to the meaningful objects from a period in time becomes an act of resistance against change. But through that very act of protest, through altering the terms on which change is experienced, the experience of change itself is transformed. What began as protest is transmuted into celebration. After all, change and the difference it produces is also part of what makes the things we care about special and distinct. So when we can shape the terms on which we confront that change, the specter of loss can reveal itself as a source of appreciation. Collecting is just such a way of shaping the terms on which the passage of time is experienced that allows us to shift our orientation towards that change from protest to celebration. So when we ask from what we should aim to save things, the answer, I think, is not some list of particular changes. It's not damage, it's not destruction, deterioration, and so on. Rather, it's from change on terms that would prevent us from exercising our agency in confronting that change, whatever the change may be. So, in other words, it isn't just change itself that conservation needs to manage, but the terms on which change is experienced. And it's by managing the terms on which we experience change that we acquire a powerful method of remembering. So, to continue building the case for this claim, I'll offer some reflections on two different kinds of cases. First, I want to consider some cases where the terms on which change is experienced shape our understanding of successful conservation, even when we might otherwise view these methods as destructive. So in particular, because the decision not to conserve facilitates a particular act of remembering. Second, I want to consider some cases where we might think that change has been managed successfully, but the terms on which conservation is achieved compromise the apparent success of that endeavor, and where the failure is cashed out, in part, in terms of a failure of memory, in particular, the way it creates impediments to remembering who we are. Examining these two kinds of cases will help bolster the claim that it's primarily management of the terms in which change is experienced, rather than any particular kinds of change that should guide our thinking about successfully saving things in ways that facilitate remembering them. So it's helpful, I think, to begin by teasing out some complications that confront one popular way of conceiving of the management of change. So this is the idea of conservation in terms of maintaining a narrative continuity, right? Continuing the story of a place or of a thing. And this is a concept that one encounters in a range of contexts, particularly those concerning cultural landscapes, but also in architecture and other fields in which conservation arises. So emphasis on narrative is friendly to that shift I was talking about from arresting change to managing change, because conserving narrative significance from the past to the future might allow for or even require physical alteration to a place. So in other words, we might need to facilitate changes to a place in order to conserve what matters about it. The philosopher Sven Arntzen contrasts an idea of static preservation with dynamic preservation. So while static preservation focuses on preventing any and all physical changes, dynamic preservation, in contrast, is focused on the relationship between people and place and how that relationship produces meaning. The idea that allowing a physical change might actually facilitate the maintenance of a relationship to a place or object in a way that static preservation is ill-positioned to do. So, for example, consider college campus. This is Wellesley College, where I teach. I know we have one Wellesley alum in the room. In order for a college campus to maintain its identity, it might in fact need to change rather than stay the same. It might need to make changes to increase accessibility or update facilities that provide access to cutting-edge scientific equipment, for example. So here's an example that I really love from Wellesley College. Wellesley College has a science center that has transformed dramatically over these 3 iterations. So the brick that you're seeing in this picture is the facade that used to be the outside of the original science building, which is like a turn of the 20th century building. Then in the 70s, the building was expanded, and you see these concrete walkways that are coming away from the outside. And in fact, this entire space that you're seeing now is enclosed in this new building in the 70s. And then very recently, because that original brick building was just like no longer functional as a scientific space in our century, what they did was they took down that entire building, preserving the facade. And then if you look through sort of into this sort of wood area, that's all this sort of brand new, very shiny, state-of-the-art facility. And so what you have here, right, is this really nice story, right, built into the space of how the building needed to change in order to maintain the identity of the space, where the identity is, an outstanding science center for the, education of students at the college. So the kinds of changes that facilitate preservation in the campus are generally gradual, right? Practices and customs that intentionally include destructive elements as components of dynamic preservation provide especially stark illustrations of the idea that change and adaptation can facilitate conservation of significance or meaning, though these methods are often dissonant with commonplace approaches to conservation in the broadly Eurocentric tradition. So consider that Shinto shrines in Japan are ritually destroyed and rebuilt every 20 years. The preservation of such a practice from past to future is inconsistent with the conservation of the shrines themselves. To take another case, wooden sculptures of the Zuni twin deities Ahayuda, which are intended to succumb to the elements, cannot properly complete their life cycle when sequestered in museum collections. So on the left, you have sort of museum display the sculptures, and this is what they're actually supposed to look like when they're done. Museums that retain these objects might position themselves as saving the sculptures from decay, but to the Zuni, the museums are in fact impeding the object's purpose. Right? Not all change is loss. For the Zuni, as I understand it, allowing the wooden sculptures to succumb to the elements is itself an act of memorialization, right? A kind of memory work. The conservation of these sculptures in museums thus does not facilitate their meaning and significance for the Zuni, but rather it primes a memory of colonial theft. And Zuni Pueblo has for decades, in a number of instances, successfully sought the repatriation of these sculptures from museums around the world. The Potawatomi philosopher Kyle Powys White discusses the concept of collective continuance, the ability of a group to self-determine how to adapt to change while avoiding harm. Collective continuance as an approach to conservation explicitly acknowledges that identities are plural and changing and places value on people's ability to adapt to change on their own terms. So many identities, both individual and collective, are bound up with culture, and it's a truism about culture that it's in a constant state of flux, right? Culture is etymologically linked to cultivation, to the work required to allow something to grow and flourish. Right? Culture is alive. And so any attempt to preserve culture and the identities bound up with it will need to be responsive to culture's mutable nature. Pressed flowers can be lovely, but that doesn't make them a substitute for living ones. But the fact that change is inherent to culture also doesn't mean that culture should simply welcome any and all changes. The point of illustrating the role of change in conservation is not to throw the doors open to any kind of change whatsoever. The source of the change still matters, as well as the terms on which it is experienced. This point helps to set a context where the decision not to conserve can aid in the maintenance or crafting of identity and memory as well. So in an article aptly titled "Colonial Ruins Are a Fitting Epitaph for the British Empire," novelist Chibundo Anuzo describes how the decision to let colonial buildings go to ruin, from Myanmar to Nigeria to India, can be part of a post-colonial nation's approach to confronting the past. To allow the material manifestations of colonial rule to fall into disrepair is a way of expressing an attitude towards this history of oppression and its ongoing legacy. It can be interpreted as a way of remembering the ongoing imprint of colonialism on these contemporary nations by allowing the buildings to stand, but adopting a critical attitude towards their impact by letting them fall apart. Or alternatively, or in addition, consider the activists in the US who have pulled down or defaced statues of Confederate monuments. To reject public symbols that maintain an identity bound up with injustice is made meaningful in part by the refusal to comport with familiar conservationist approaches. It's the very abrogation of preservationist norms surrounding statues that makes the expressive power of these actions all the more salient, and in many instances also quite beautiful. For a similar kind of point in a completely different context, the author Maurice Sendak, I love this picture, once told a story about sending a drawing to a child whose mother reported that the child loved the drawing so much that he ate it. Sendak recounts taking this act as a great compliment. Sometimes unconventional ways of expressing appreciation are inconsistent with familiar modes of preservation, and they gain their expressive power in part from transgressing them. It's because eating the drawing was an unconventional expression of love that its destruction is ultimately interpreted by Sendak as a high compliment. Moreover, though that little drawing may have easily been misplaced or damaged in coming years, no one is going to forget this story, right? You know that kid's mom is going to be telling the story forever. The point is that the valence of destruction can't always be read off the act alone, and our understanding must incorporate the terms on which it occurs, the way in which the source of the destruction and its ramifications might, perhaps counterintuitively, facilitate processes of remembering. So perhaps one of the clearest pieces of evidence for the important link between cultural preservation, cultural memory, and identity is how frequently oppressive powers have labored to stamp out, suppress, and erase culture specifically in order to destroy or subjugate a group of people. In such contexts, the reasons for conservation that stem from the maintenance of identity are going to be especially powerful. If terms such as deterioration or decay conjure stories of natural causes for damage, suppression and erasure summon intentional ones. When change is imposed against our will, conservation can be a way of exercising autonomy, inserting our agency into change that was impelled by forces beyond our control. But to act in the face of natural or unintended changes has a different meaning from acting in the face of intentional destruction. An object that I cherish might deteriorate over time, but its ultimate disappearance would not necessarily be an affront to me in the way it would be if you maliciously destroyed it. The meaning of intentional destruction, too, is shaped by context, including the motivation for the action and who performs it. So the fact that tomorrow is the designated time for the ritualized destruction and rebuilding of a Shinto shrine would not license a passerby to frivolously light the structure on fire today. And we would have good reason to save the shrine from this fate, its imminent demolition notwithstanding. It's difficult to make sense of these important distinctions if we focus on preserving the structure or object alone. Rather, it's the broader context of meaning within which the object is couched that imbues the source of change with its particular significance. What the source of the change means to me or to us as the people who care about the threatened thing will shape how it makes sense to respond. So when a change or loss is the result of intentional destruction or suppression, it can thus lend moral force to the prospect of conservation. For example, commenting on a collaborative language revitalization program between Fort Lewis College and the Southern Ute Indian tribe, Jenny Trujillo explains, quote, "Language in the boarding schools were stolen. Because of the fact that languages were stolen, it's our educational and even moral responsibility to revitalize these languages." right? The moral imperative stemming from the theft, stemming from the source of the change and the terms on which it is experienced. Perhaps then the very fact that something was stolen or threatened gives us a special reason to recover or save it. The philosopher G.K. Jeffers has advocated for the importance of preserving cultural traditions connected to racial identities as a form of resistance against racial oppression. In a context where the forces of colonialism and its attendant racism sought to erase, devalue, and degrade the cultures of colonized peoples, the preservation of those very cultural traditions takes on a particular salience. It need not embrace a static form of preservation, and Jeffers urges the importance of turning a critical eye on cultural traditions that may themselves involve injustices. Nor is the aim of cultural preservation in the face of colonialism to provoke fights over authenticity or police the boundaries of cultural essences. But to celebrate culture in the face of its attempted degradation is to take a powerful stand against what is, at heart, an attack on one's own person. The act of working to preserve a cultural tradition can thus be seen not as an attempt to arrest change, but as a way of resisting certain sources of change, namely those that stem from an effort to destroy culture in the name of domination, that would seek to prevent a people from remembering who they are. So it isn't change per se that we should save things from, but change experienced on terms that would control our ability to confront that change. So we've already seen examples of how the terms in which change is experienced or confronted can shape the character of that change, in particular its valence and moral contours. The distribution of power and authority within contemporary institutions devoted to preservation and conservation makes the negotiation of these terms complex and morally fraught. It would be a mistake to think that merely involving some members of particular communities in preservation work is sufficient to alter the terms on which change is confronted. So how precisely communities come to be engaged in saving things itself contributes to the nature of these terms. So for example, the philosopher Shelby Meissner explores the complex ways in which indigenous participation in efforts to preserve both language and the environment can be negatively conditioned by the terms on which this participation is elicited and allowed by those in positions of institutional power. In the case of language preservation, Meissner argues that language revitalization efforts led by organizations such as UNESCO and US and Canadian universities can reinforce dependency relationships between indigenous groups and institutions that are part of the very colonial systems that led to linguicide in the first place. They do this in part by requiring indigenous communities to perform a certain kind of trauma, in particular portraying themselves as helpless victims in need of aid in order to be eligible for access to resources. This, as Meissner puts it, returns us to a narrative in which indigenous people cannot heal from our imposed trauma without the assistance of the researchers, universities, and nation-states complicit in our colonization. Moreover, when language archives are maintained by these institutions, they typically end up controlling the archives, generating false dilemmas about how to navigate access to sometimes sensitive materials by making the archives available to all versus restricting access. So what makes such dilemmas false, according to Meissner, is that they're ultimately a consequence of non-indigenous institutions exercising control over archival access in the first place. Archives are paradigmatic instances of institutions meant to bolster collective memory, to serve as a bulwark against forgetting. But as this case illustrates, the terms on which archives are created, maintained, controlled, and accessed can itself shape the nature of the memories that it preserved. In the case of environmental conservation, Meissner explains how indigenous lifeways and practices surrounding relationships to the environment, such as through water, were, quote, conceptually carved up and rendered as parcels or mere resources by non-indigenous institutions. For example, the process through which the US government requires federally recognized tribes to quantify and monetize water imposes a colonial way of thinking on indigenous relationships to water. Indigenous practices and relationships go into the colonial policy machine, and rights and resources come out the other side. It may be that such resources are ultimately conserved by such policies and create some benefits for the relevant tribes, but at the cost of forcing these communities to reconceive of their relationship to the environment on these imposed colonial terms, thinking about water as a resource. This disturbs processes of collective memory by interrupting the continued practices and relationships that sustain that memory. In other words, it can be conceived as an approach to conservation that imposes forgetting on a community. Both of these cases are incredibly complex, and I encourage you to check out Meissner's papers about them if you're interested in more details. And they require the deep expertise of impacted parties to craft viable solutions. And surely the implication is not that major educational institutions or governments should forego applying their considerable resources to supporting indigenous peoples and culture. My aim in raising these cases here is to highlight the way that preservation efforts that might seem good on their face, right? Saving languages, saving water access, can be morally compromised by the processes involved and the terms on which relevant communities are able to participate in these projects. Conservation practices that preclude participation on the right terms can be actively harmful to the communities whose identities are most closely bound up with the very things that conservation aims to save. A conservation project that preserves a language by requiring indigenous communities to relive and perform trauma while fostering dependency on non-indigenous institutions is far from an optimal outcome, to put it mildly. Under such conditions, the relevant linguistic communities might aim to save their language as much from these institutions as from extinction. So I think it's worth attending to a subtle mechanism that helps connect conservation practice to these power dynamics that I've been talking about. So in the context of contemporary art, the philosopher Sherry Irvin has recently discussed the way that either applying or withholding conservation can facilitate an artwork's ability to express something through exemplification. So to exemplify a feature is both to possess it and refer to it. As philosopher Catherine Elgin puts the point, an exemplar is a telling instance of the features it exemplifies. It presents those features in a context contrived to render them salient. So fabric swatches and carpet samples are classic examples, right? A carpet sample, excuse me, goodness. A carpet sample possesses the features that a potential carpet will, right? Its color, its texture, et cetera. And it's also designed to refer to those very features, right? It presents them to the consumer in order to facilitate making a choice about the features of the carpet. Importantly, though, the context helps determine which features are salient. So for example, the size and the shape of a carpet sample are not being exemplified by the sample unless you're putting a carpet in a dollhouse. On Irvin's view, conservation, or the withholding of conservation, can be a way of manipulating the context in order to maintain certain meaningful features of contemporary art. This can be part of the process through which exemplars can be especially expressive. For example, Irvin explains how the expressive power of Kara Walker's A Subtlety, or The Marvelous Sugar Baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant. It's the full title of the work. A monumental sugar sculpture was heightened through its exemplification of the process of dissolving. As Irvin puts it, quote, "The literal exemplification of impending destruction activates a metaphor of the fragility and preciousness of our beings, the power we have over each other, the tragedy of disrespect and disregard." So not only is the sculpture dissolving, but it's referring to the process of dissolving in order to deliver a point. It's expression through exemplification. On the flip side, Irvin describes how Mark Quinn's self-portrait busts, which are made from his own frozen blood, express the visceral precarity of human life precisely through the intensive maintenance required to keep the blood in its frozen state. So to maintain Quinn's work, or not maintain Walker's then, is part of how the context is contrived to make features salient, fostering their expressive power. But conservation doesn't simply function as an external force, right? A kind of scaffolding that can facilitate the expressive power of an object while remaining outside of it. By manipulating the context of maintenance, display, and reception, conservation becomes part of how we understand the thing that is being conserved. Conservation doesn't just help other things to exemplify, conservation practice itself can exemplify, embedding what it both instantiates and refers to in our understanding of the thing conserved. So Quinn's self-portraits can't even be what they are without the conservation apparatus designed to maintain them. It is as much a part of the lifeblood of the artwork as his own blood. This power of conservation to exemplify extends far beyond the world of contemporary art. Right? So if institutions that take the lead in the conservation of an object, practice, or place are bound up with the very forces that threatened it in the first place, as in Meissner's examples concerning indigenous language preservation or water access, then that conservation work, even if it's successful in saving something, would exemplify the same assertion of power that created the problem. It would express the dependence of the marginalized on the powerful. It both represents these dynamics and it calls attention to them. However, just as exclusionary conservation practices can serve to exemplify relationships of oppression and marginalization, so too can participatory conservation practices alter the terms on which change is confronted by exemplifying cultural resilience and autonomy. So recall Chike Jeffers' point that preserving cultural traditions can serve as an act of resistance against oppression. In order to achieve this goal, the oppressed parties need to play a role in preservation. It's only by actually having the features of collaboration and participation that a conservation practice can exemplify resilience and resistance, shaping the terms on which change is experienced. Right? Someone else can't do that for you. It wouldn't then have the features, and thus it couldn't then exemplify. So terms that allow for community participation can in turn lay the groundwork for the achievement of distinctively participatory goods in conservation practice. That is, goods whose very existence depends on their being pursued and shared together. Indeed, the maintenance of collective memory is plausibly one such participatory good. So there are a lot of examples of this across conservation contexts of all kinds, and I'm going to close by just briefly mentioning three. So discussing military to wildlife refuge restoration. So these are former military lands that have been remediated to serve as local species habitats and sometimes recreation centers. Marian Hordikin and David Havlick emphasize the importance of the social dimensions of restoration work. So drawing on the idea of a focal restoration project that engages people in the process of restoration, promoting community involvement and democratic engagement in restoration decisions, they illustrate how participatory restoration practices can work to not only restore the landscape, but restore the relationship between people and place through their very involvement, right? In contrast with a technical, expert-driven restoration project that simply hands the finished product over to the community. Restoring something, and in particular restoring a relationship, is a kind of salvaging of memory, a recollection of how things once were that might be reclaimed in the present. If participation in the process is pivotal to restoring not just the land, but our relationship with it, then we uncover another example of how the terms on which we experience change in turn shape the possibilities and promise of that very change. In a different context, in discussing the conservation of practices surrounding the harvesting of wild rice for Anishinaabe peoples in the Great Lakes, Kyle White, who we heard from before, highlights the way that food staples can function as a hub for a whole network of social relations that are, as he puts it, biological, ecological, cultural, economic, political, and spiritual. The key is that these goods are not secured by the object alone. They're not secured by wild rice alone, but by the traditional social processes through which it is cultivated, harvested, distributed, and so on. These participatory goods cannot accompany, for example, the US government distributing bags of rice to Anishinaabe peoples, even if that might in some way conserve a heritage food staple. The goods in question require community participation in order to be achieved, and also to not be forgotten. A final example concerns the role of digital methods in conservation. So digital methods raise many important questions for conservation. For example, in what sense does a digital copy of an object or structure preserve it? In what sense can we claim that digital replicas are authentic? These are huge questions, and I explore them a little bit in the book. Here, I just want to highlight one fascinating example, I think, of how community participation in digital preservation efforts can facilitate processes of remembering. The example is the Accord project. That's archaeological community co-production of research resources. So this is a project where researchers worked with 10 different community heritage groups in Scotland to co-design and co-produce digital and sometimes physical representations at local heritage sites. So the elements of co-design and production allowed community members to direct the selection of sites and objects to produce on the basis of their local significance, and to be actively involved in the technical process of generating the representations. So they're teaching people how to use this complex machinery. Based on qualitative studies conducted through the process, the researchers note that, quote, the Accord project provides clear evidence that the digital models accrue similar values to originals, becoming imbued with symbolic associations related to identity and place. So crucially, the link between the digital replicas and the attribution of authenticity was forged by the role of community participation in the production of the replicas. So as one participant noted, it's authentic because we made it. Performing the work of creating digital replicas in turn created connections between people, objects, and places that allowed participants to become part of the story they were uncovering, a reminder of the idea that history continues to unfold and weave new threads into its tapestry. The evidence provided by the Accord project concerning the role of community participation in lending digital replicas an aura of authenticity should come as no surprise given the theoretical framework we've been discussing. What makes the authenticity of the original objects and sites meaningful in the first place is the role that they play in the lives of a community. No wonder then that the participation of that community in the production of replicas grants these products a connected significance. Community involvement in the replication process also replicates the context of meaning in which the originals are embedded. This is a sense in which the participation in digital conservation work not only recovers a sense of heritage memory, but renews that memory by reestablishing its significance in our time, helping to ensure that it won't be forgotten. So there are many more such examples of participatory conservation we could refer to, and indeed my sense is that such approaches are becoming increasingly common in lots of conservation institutions of different kinds. The considerations that I've discussed in this talk offer further justification for why precisely these participatory approaches can matter. Failure to facilitate the ability of individuals and communities to manage change on their own terms will often undermine the success of conservation projects precisely because the nature and significance of change itself is in part a function of the terms on which that change is experienced. Finally, this approach is also salutary for confronting cases where saving things is impossible, where change itself cannot be managed, and the only thing we can hope to control are the terms on which that change is experienced. So this brings us back to the story of the Jodes. Right? They asked, how can we live without our lives? How will we know it's us without our past when confronting a bunch of stuff that they think that they cannot save? Right? Were they able to save any of those things in the story? No. But they resolved not to sacrifice their sense of self in the process. Rather, they did the only thing they could in the context. They took control of the terms on which change was experienced. No, they said, leave it, burn it. They sat and looked at it and burned it into their memories. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I might have misunderstood your point about authenticity. So you seem to say that or imply that it's entirely socially constructed. And I would sort of want to sort of question that a little bit. So, going to like the standing stone example, if there was a standing stone that was really significant to a community, and overnight it was replaced with an exact replica, and the community didn't know, and they kept treating it with the same significance, would we be comfortable saying it's the authentic standing stone? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Yeah, those are tricky cases where we're in the setup of the case, we assume that people don't know, right? Because like when you assume that something has been replaced and nobody knows, it puts pressure on the question of whether it's a feature of the thing itself that matters, or rather if the authenticity is predicated on the beliefs of the individuals, right? So in this case, their beliefs, it would be false, but they would still have those beliefs, right? So sometimes people bring up these cases in order to try to show why authenticity matters, right? Where they'll say like, well, look, maybe they are still stand in awe of the covertly replaced stone, right? But then somebody tells them that it's a replica, and it's like if their concern for it immediately disappears, right? That's supposed to be indicative of the idea that like the genuineness of the object really did matter. So I think that the case that you just described, though, is different from the kind of case that was coming up in the Accord project, precisely because it wasn't a case of kind of like covert manipulation or people not knowing that something was replaced with a replica, but rather the replica and even the choice of what to replicate was itself the product of this kind of participatory social process. So the idea then is that at least in this dimension of authenticity, the dimension that comes from the significance that something has for a people as a product of a particular culture, the thought is that, well, this too is the product of a relevant cultural context, right? It's coming out of the same kind of web of social meanings that lent significance to the original in the first place. So the thought isn't that the replica could replace the original, right? I think oftentimes when we talk about replicas and authenticity, people frame it in terms of like, well, like if you just replace the original with a replica, like that would be worse. And it's like, sure, okay, but like usually we're not talking about replacing originals with replicas. We're talking about like, well, what other work can a replica do? And so I think that the idea here is that there's an important kind of authenticity that the replica would accrue through this process. That wouldn't necessarily make it the same as the original, but it might make it meaningful in a similar kind of space. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoy the lecture. So I'm not really an expert, so this might be a naive question, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you think about the relationship between the ideal of conservation and something like the ideal of curation. So this is what I have in mind. The picture that I think you painted is something like this. Change is bad, but it's going to happen anyway. So a bad way to respond to this fact is to try and stop change. And so since change is going to happen, deterioration is going to happen, it can't be stopped. The best that we can do is to control, shape the way it happens so that we can preserve ourselves as best as possible in this process of degradation. So I wonder if we could, if there's a second ideal, was that more or less acceptable?
I mean, I would reject the idea that change itself is bad.
Good.
Yeah. But the rest of it, I think.
Okay,
yes.
good. So maybe this is something that is already part of your pitches. I was thinking, there seemed to be. I was thinking about this other way of thinking about this problem. So imagine there's some new technology made it very easy to avoid the deterioration of certain works of art, for example. And so now we don't have the problem of, say, paying to choose which work of art we are going to keep as part of our society, say, keep on display. So now we don't have, in a sense, the problem of counteracting the effect of change. Those works are not going to deteriorate, right? But it seems that one of our, one of the things we should try and do if you're interested in conservation is still decide which of these works of art we want to preserve in some sense, and make them prominent and ensure that our children will have access to them. And so the ideal here is something like this. It's something like, it's not so much that we are trying to preserve who we are by exercising as much control as we have over this change that is going to happen, but it's more like we are trying to curate who we want to be. We are trying to shape who we want to be. So it's the different I see. The first, as I see it, there is a contrast with at least the way I understood the previous picture. The previous picture was something like, someone might think this way about getting old. Someone might think, I wish my body didn't get any older than 30 years old. But since it's gonna get older, it's good for me that I have control of the way in which the body changes. But that seems to be, I think, not the second ideal that I mentioned it goes beyond this.
Yes. So I think I mostly just want to say yes. Like conservation, is a way of shaping who we want to be in this sense, right? So because of that link that I was talking about between conservation and identity, right? If like who we are, some sort of conception of ourselves, either individually or collectively, is bound up with what we care about, right, and what we care for, then part of that is going to involve the kind of process you're talking about of curation, of sort of saying like these are the things that we want to highlight or put on display, right? Quite apart from questions about just saving things, right? And we already do that, right? I mean, you think about like major museums, for instance, right? They have millions of objects, only a tiny fraction of which are on display, right? Why are those ones on display? Well, it's part of a curatorial process of like shaping understandings of what people think is important, right? Or derives from and shapes, right? A sense of what people think is important. So you can sort of pull that apart from the just saving things part conceptually. I do think that they often come together though, right? Partially just because of the sort of realities of the cases that we face that your sort of hypothetical led us away from, right? Which is sort of like limited resources, limited ability to control, right? It's often that those limitations that make it the case that what we are faced with deciding to save goes hand in hand with that more sort of curatorial process you described. So that's a long way of saying yes.
Would it be then fair to say then this ideal of conservation that you care about, it's just perhaps a contingent matter that those questions arise in response to change? Because I think the ideal that I was interested in is one in which conservation is not necessarily a response to change that is going to happen anyway.
I have to think about that, whether change is incidental to the picture, because I mean you might think that change just the inevitability of change like just is one of those limitations that we face, that it's hard to even hypothetically abstract away from, right? Because even if we're not thinking about change in terms of like loss or deterioration, right? There's other kinds of change, right? Changes in people's sort of interest and attention and taste and all those things. And so if we try to abstract away from all of that, I start to lose a grip on like what kind of society are we talking about? So I'm not sure, but I'll think about that more. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Hello, thank you very, very much for such a rich lecture. I was wondering if you have any strategies that we can use when the idea of what should be remembered and forgotten is greatly at odds in the same place. Similar to the US, in the UK, what is worthy of remembering and holding sacred around the idea of Britishness and what idea of Britishness should be reproduced is a matter that is very much severing, if not already severed, the nation. Of course, the colonial statues, there's one. The National Trust properties in England, greatly beloved, embroiled in legacies of slavery, which of course it caused a lot of upset on both sides, criticising Churchill is akin to apostasy here. So when the idea of what should be remembered is so greatly at odds, do you have any methods or strategies for ways that we can arrive at kind of collective conservation?
Yeah, I wish. If I had,
If you had that, is that in the book?
I think. I mean, so I wish I had an answer, right? Because this is such an important question, and if I had the answer, I would probably, be very famous. So I would say, like, indirect suggestions that might point us down the road towards solving the problem, but I don't have solutions. So here's one of the things that I do talk about these kinds of cases in the book, and one of the things that I sort of try to explain is the idea that the step of recognizing how strong the link often is between a desire to preserve a thing and people's sense of self or sense of identity can be the first step towards arriving at a sort of sense of common ground or shared understanding about what exactly is at stake, right? And so the reason I don't really have an answer is because once you go through that process, I think it often becomes less about conservation of any particular thing, whether it's a statue or a practice or whatever, and becomes about these other really complicated issues concerning like who we want to be, right, as a people, right? And of course, there's no easy solution to like who do we want to be as a people. That's going to be something that needs to be right sort of hashed out in these kinds of like messy collective processes. But if I could sort of like tell you like a quick story about like why I think this kind of indirect method can be helpful. There's a town in Massachusetts that I used to live in, and there was this big controversy a couple of years ago because there's like a little dam on the Charles River in the town, and the town council did this like environmental and economic study, and they said we should really get rid of this dam. It's not good ecologically. It needs repair, and it's going to cost way more money to repair it than to get rid of it. Let's just get rid of it, And there were people in the town that lost their minds about it. Like people were very upset, right? And I think it's very easy to look at that and be like, whoa, it's just like this little dam on the river on the edge of town. Like it's not that big a deal. But I think it's like essential to recognize that for these people, it really was a big deal. And they really did see their sense of self wrapped up in it. And when I was talking about this with somebody, they pointed me to this research paper that I hadn't encountered before that was just about the relationship between like individual and collective identity and dams on rivers in New England. Like, I mean, it's a thing, right? It wasn't even just this town, right? And so, why do I say this is like an indirect approach? It's like, well, recognizing that people really do genuinely feel like some aspect of the identity of the place that they grew up and live is bound up with this particular structure is not going to help us, immediately solve disagreements about whether to get rid of it or not. But I think it does change the terms, right, on which we think about that problem, right? And so I think you can like export that to some of these other even messier cases, right? I think it can be very easy for one side, for both sides, to demonize each other in these kinds of contexts and not really take seriously the gravity that the decision has for people. And so my hope is that once we recognize that link between conservation and identity, right, that's the thing that I'm trying to sort of build out in the book. Once we recognize that, we have this sort of different platform from which to approach the question about then what do we do? And I wish I had a good answer about how to solve those really messy ones, but I don't. Yeah.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And you're speaking to deep listening or listening. That's just definitely not happening. So listening seems to be a huge part of conservation going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If conservation is related and fixed to the authentic, if there is a problem in defining what constitutes the authenticity of an object, is that problematic? I'm thinking particularly of Stonehenge. How would you define what was authentically Stonehenge, given the historical changes and the cultural changes of use which define that history?
Yeah, good. I mean, I think it's often a mistake to try to like index authenticity to a particular point in time and then treat that as a benchmark for our goals when it comes to conservation and restoration. I mean, you can see this really starkly in instances of environmental restoration. So like in the literature, people in environmental restoration call this the baseline problem. So the idea is that if we want to restore a particular ecosystem, right, what are we restoring it to, right? Like, how do you choose a time, right? A point at which you set your target. The worry is that any way of answering that question is going to be arbitrary in some way. And so you're left without a particular baseline to go back to. And so that problem is part of what has led people in some of those literature to think about, well, if we're not trying to restore something to a particular way it was at a particular time or a particular look or something else, what are we trying to restore, right? And this is where you sort of get the idea of like restoring the kind of significance that the thing had, restoring our relationship to the thing. So there are lots of different ways of thinking about the target of restoration in particular that can come apart from restoring it to how it was at some particular time, which, as you know, it can be problematic because of these competing notions about, well, what is the authentic way for it to be, right? You get this with paintings too, right? It's like, is the authentic way for the painting to be how it looked when it was painted, or did the artist intend for the hues to mellow over time, right? So like, how do we set those goals? Those are tricky questions when it comes to just trying to use authenticity as like the sole arbiter of what our restoration or conservation goals should be.
Okay, good evening and thank you. I'd like to hear some of your thoughts about what would be the spectrum in conservation between hoarding and basically minimalism absolute, because I have seen that even though I know that hoarding can become a legitimate mental issue, mental problem, illness, I know that sometimes it can be a response to trauma, to the trauma of loss, that some people respond to loss by basically hoarding everything in sight. And some people respond to loss by becoming minimalist. I think I remember that haiku that says, my house burnt down, I have a better view of the rising moon. And how I'd like to hear your thoughts on how is it that this spectrum, because I know that it's not one or against, and because sometimes people who do conservation, we're accused of being hoarders of buildings and hoarders of stuff. And from a philosophical viewpoint, how is that spectrum addressed?
Yeah, that's really interesting. When I published this book, a colleague said something to me like, oh, like I really need some help with figuring out how to clean out my attic, but I guess I'm not going to get that from your book. And I was like, actually, I do talk about cleaning out your attic in the book. So I mean, I am interested in those, in sort of the personal dimension of it too, just like in the sort of the individual context when we, as just sort of everyday folks, are thinking about, well, what should we save? So like one of the cases that I think is interesting is being left stuff by your parents or grandparents, right? And like oftentimes we feel this sense of responsibility for these things, right? Sometimes we don't even know what these things are, right? There's like boxes and boxes of them. And so we're faced with this kind of problem. And so I don't think there's any one solution to that problem. But I think one helpful way of thinking about it can be in terms of whether particular things are significant to you, right? Whether they spark some kind of memory, right? Whether you have a kind of like recognition associated with them. So sometimes like a single thing can function as a good representation of a relationship that you care about or want to remember, for instance, right? Where it might actually dilute that relationship to have it, amongst a bunch of other stuff that you have like no association with at all, and you're like, it just happened to be given to you, and you're like, I don't even know what this is or why it mattered. So sometimes we can use those kinds of methods to sort of like pare down what we think is significant to save, even when we sort of like feel the pull of responsibility towards trying to save everything. But at the same time, sort of like to pull it in the other direction, I do think that it's often worth being, somewhat like risk averse with respect to saving things. It of course depends on like the particular like material constraints we face and whether we can save things or not. But like in the absence of, a compelling reason to get rid of things, it can often be good to hang on to them, even if they're not meaningful to you. Because one of the things that we can do by saving things is that we then offer the opportunity for other people to care about them or to save them, right? So, you might, for instance, save some things that aren't particularly meaningful to you from like a family, tradition or something like that, because then you offer the opportunity for your kids to care about them. And maybe your kids won't care about them, but like at least you've like conserved the possibility, right? I think that's a kind of gift, right? To say like, this is a thing that might matter to you. And it's okay if it doesn't, right? But at least you sort of passed on the opportunity. So that's leans a little bit in the different direction in terms of like maximalism versus minimalism. But like I said, I don't think there's sort of one easy solution. I do think it matters that we think about why, right? Like why save this, right? If you only save something because you have some sort of like free-floating sense of responsibility that you can't really pin down, that might not ultimately be that compelling for you at the end of the day.
Hi there. Thank you very much for your lecture. It's really given me a lot to think on. I did think more towards the end about the concept of non-physical preservation. And I think that issue is becoming more contemporarily pertinent these days, especially when we think about the preservation of the internet and the preservation of digital items. I often find that internet culture is one of the most salient forms of culture we have in the modern day. And when I think about how we preserve that, or if we should preserve it, I think about like the Internet Archive, where you preserve art, literature, information, and less the physical structure of something. I'm wondering what your thinking is when it comes to how we might go about preserving these things and how we should preserve them and how we conceptualize our identities by preserving something digitally, or given the breadth of information that you would be preserving and the absolute totality of the entire internet, how, if we even should preserve some parts of it?
Yeah, super complicated question. I mean, I do write at some length about digital preservation in the book. In part, because of the ways in which it gets back to the first question, right? So I have some critical things to say about digital preservation, because there can be this sort of impulse, if not from digital preservationists themselves, I don't think they necessarily have this impulse, but in like the way that the media talks about digital preservation, there is this impulse to think about digital replicas as preserving the things, right, that they are replicas of, right? So there was like this news article I was talking about where they're like, especially it was written in the context of a lot of sort of destruction of built heritage during military conflict in Syria, and some people had done some digital preservation projects, and the headline was like, well, no one can destroy these, right? And it's like, yeah, okay, but like, that doesn't make them replacements for things that are destroyed. There might be amazing things about them. I'm very much not like opposed to digital replication conservation projects. I think a lot of them do really interesting things, right? But the problem can often be sort of presenting that as, right, a stand-in for another thing. But then, what goes hand in hand with that is the idea. People often think of digital preservation as somehow being like safer than the preservation of material objects, right, in the real world, which is like totally mistaken, right? Like digital media is incredibly precarious, right? So like the idea that once we sort of like made a digital scan of something, it's like it's safe now, right, is not true at all, because like technology changes at this like incredibly fast rate. We like lose the ability to access, right, digital content that we've preserved, right? This happens in like video game conservation, right? People, sorry, I'm like only talking this side. People save video games from whatever, like the original Atari, and then it's like actually having the hardware with which to play those games actually suddenly becomes very difficult, because we're like we don't have the machinery, right? So digital preservation is also not necessarily secure in the way that sometimes people think it is. But then, sorry, I'm just like big wind up to your actual question. But then we have sort of all the stuff that's like purely like digital, like internet stuff, where the volume of it is such that the prospect of saving it seems impossible, right? Like how could we, like I feel like I think about it a lot in terms of like the difference between saving somebody's like material correspondence, right? So it's like you can like read the letters of Robert Lowell or whatever, and it's like nobody's going to read the emails of somebody from today because it would be terrible, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
and sorry,
please.
to join on to your point.
Yeah.
I have to think the method of that is also quite impersonal compared to the physical. Because of course, if you're saving like a physical, like to take your example, saving a physical letter is a lot more of a personal act, and it's a lot more of an identity preserving act than like saving a TXT file, for example. So I wonder, like, with your ideas that you mentioned in the lecture of the method of preservation changing the identity of something, how saving something digitally may form its identity in the future compared to saving it digitally in another way. Well, for example, like preserving it physically on like a tape, for example.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the particular, if there are differences in the methods of digital preservation that we take, then that might itself, right, sort of set the salience of the thing that we preserve. We might like choose to use particular methods for things that we really care about, right? Whereas, in order to personalize them in the way that you describe, right, but not use that for like all of the myriad things that we might save. But yeah, I mean, partially I was just sort of winding up to say like, I have no idea. I don't know how we're supposed to like. I think it's a great question because there's so much, and I'm sure that there are specialists focusing on digital media who have thoughts about that. But part of the compromise of the 30,000-foot view that I talked about is that it can be hard to see all the details from up there. So I'm really not sure.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Eric. Thank you so much for such a great talk. One thing that occurred to me listening to you talk today was that you seem to place a lot of the value of conservation in the process rather than the outcome. And you don't give us like a determinative method for that process, but you have some suggestions, like you said. So some people's identities are bound up in some objects. That fact doesn't tell us like how we should preserve or make decisions about those objects, but to honor their identities, we might involve them in the process. It doesn't seem, the value of that doesn't seem to lie just in the method, but partly in the outcome. Because if we involve Indigenous people, if we center Indigenous people in decision-making about Indigenous artifacts and landmarks, presumably that's not just the right thing to do, but we might also collectively be better placed to learn about Indigenous culture or our past. That you can make that point with respect to practically anything. So I'm wondering, to put this like, that's a particular example, to put it like in a slightly different way, whether there's also value that, your account can capture that's related to the outcome. So, one reason is because, the benefit of involving certain people in the process of decision-making about heritage is that we'd be better placed to, involving, again, Indigenous groups in how to manage an archive or an exhibition is going to lead us to have a better display of their histories. It's not going to be a whitewashed history. But you might sometimes involve people in decision making, and they might actually make bad decisions as well. And so there might be multiple reasons actually not to just involve certain people in certain processes, but for them to also have a certain kind of like to drive at a certain kind of outcome, and that would suggest a kind of like a responsibility to make certain kinds of decisions. So I'm wondering, all of this is a bit obviously loose, but I'm wondering whether your theory of like preservation, although it puts a lot of value in the process, can capture some of the sort of like the importance and even the responsibility of directing that process at certain outcomes.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. That's a hard question. I mean, I think part of part of what I would want to say is that I wouldn't necessarily want to distinguish sharply between process and product, right? So like a lot of the processes that I'm talking about are going to shape the nature of the outcomes in really significant ways, right? So if like you think about like the Zuni wooden sculpture case that I was talking about before, right? So like conserved in the museums, you have a certain product, which is like the preservation of the physical wooden sculpture, right? Maintenance of its physical integrity, right? Once they've been repatriated and they're treated the way that the Zuni traditionally treat them, they're allowed to succumb to the elements, right? So like there you have a different process, but the process also leads to different outcomes or products in the two cases. One, the maintenance of the material object, other, right, the sort of slow decay in the elements, right? And so I don't know that I would necessarily always want to like pull those things apart. At the same time, I am sort of concerned, like in a good way, about the point you make about, you know, the way in which that we don't want to lose sight of the fact that in at least some conservation contexts, we might have some goals in mind that we would use to assess whether we think that the conservation effort has been successful or not, right? That seem to stand apart from the particular process that's involved. I don't know if I have like a general illuminating things to say about that. I think it's going to depend a lot on the particular thing that we're talking about saving. But yeah, I mean, I think it does seem like there would be, you know, a loss if, you know, let's say you've got a case of like, you know, sort of like federal versus local, right? And sort of like the, you know, the federal conservation or like a national conservation group, you know, wants to do some particular thing, and we come in and say like, no, like we want people to be able to participate in this conservation process, like empower sort of like local people who like live near this site to like lead the restoration process, and they like are like, okay, great, like parking lot. That seems bad, right? Even though like we've allowed people to sort of like participate in the process. So it seems like there have to be some like guardrails on it.
Yeah, this was initially what I was thinking about, because, you know, if we suddenly became incredibly nihilistic and we just wanted to destroy everything, we would have actually honored your theory of like, you know, the value was in the process but left nothing behind for our future. So
yeah, right. So the value can't only be in the process. I guess, I mean, maybe we might appeal to the idea that like when we talk about participation in terms of participatory goods, right? Maybe like a good in like a philosopher's loose sense needs to be achieved through the participation and not a bad, right? Participatory bads are bad, right? Just like participatory goods are goods. We of course need sort of like a better sense of like how to define the goods versus the bads, which is going to be contextual and also just, you know, a big philosophical project. But I think that's a really good question, and I don't have an easy answer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. My question relates to legacies, and maybe this is important to mention. This is legacy-related context. So we have this participatory design and the shared sort of collective coordinated effort, shared participation really, around conservation and preservation practices. When does the next, and how does the next phase come in terms of passing on to the next generation? How do we instill that duty for a future recalibration? Is it enough? And how does that look to instill that guardianship, custodianship, and stewardship type of mindset?
Yeah, great question. I mean, to some extent, I think like participation is also the key there, right? So like getting sort of younger generations involved in the processes of caring for things, or, you know, performing traditions, sort of like making things that matter to one generation salient to a future generation, is often going to involve sort of like bringing them in, inviting them into those very processes, right? So, you know, I'm a parent, and in my experience, right, like kids don't respond very well to being like browbeaten about things they should care about, right? They don't want to be told, you should care about this, right? But if you sort of like point in the direction, sort of like guide them the way, involve them in something, right? Then like they often do come to see the value in it. Not always, right? But it's by engaging them in those activities or in those processes that they can come to see that value. So I think that that's the sort of the direction I would point.
Yes, no, absolutely. And the participative design is there. But from your findings, from your research, if I may ask, what did you find from aesthetics, from broader philosophy, other fields of philosophy?
Yeah, no, I don't know that like that particular question about sort of like maintaining the value of things intergenerationally in the sense that you have in mind, that kind of like practical like dimension of it came up as much. One thing I do in the last chapter of my book, which is about sort of saving things for the future in part, one thing I encountered doing research was, I'm not an ethnographer, so I rely on other people's ethnography. And I was reading this really interesting ethnography of conservationists, and there was some discussion with a conservationist who was worried about the idea that if people in 100 years just sort of stopped caring about the things that he was conserving, that his life would have been like wasted, right? And I think that's an idea that I want to resist, right? I think that the value of caring for things can't be predicated on whether people in 100 or 1,000 years care about them, because part of the reason why we're caring for these things isn't just so that somebody in the future can value them or enjoy them, but it's also so that we now can do those things. And like I was mentioning in response to another question, it's also we, in doing so, at least sort of provide the opportunity for the future generations to make their own decisions. And so like that in itself has value, quite apart from whether they end up valuing the same things that we value.
Hi, yeah, really enjoyed that. Thanks so much. I was just thinking about the relationship between preservation and conservation, and how you see those two terms, because preservation feels to me a bit more of a static thing, perhaps. And in your example, you were talking about with the indigenous tribe of and something that maybe that museums do a lot of, whereas conservation feels like a more active, participatory thing. Which, but I don't know. I guess they both are. But I just wondered how you use the terms, and is there any difference? Or
yeah, super complicated, because the terms get used differently across different disciplinary contexts. So one of the decisions that I had to make very on in writing the book was sort of like, what language am I going to use? So I've got some stuff in the intro about like why I'm talking about conservation. So I use conservation as kind of a catch-all for conservation, preservation, restoration, et cetera, and then use preservation specifically in the sense of just like saving something, but without attention to the method through which we save it. But that's not at all universal. So there are also like regional differences, right? In some countries, they prefer preservation to conservation. In environmental contexts, conservation and preservation have rather different meanings. Like preservation is often used to refer to like preserving the natural environment for its own sake, whereas conservation is used for saving it for the sake of humans or perhaps other animals, right? So yeah, it's one of those sets of terms that is like really sticky because it gets used in so many different ways, and you just kind of need to like stipulate how you're going to use it and go from there. Yeah. But thanks for asking. It's a good question.
So I think I'll try a question now. So you've presented this core. I want to go back to the story that you started with about the family who are preserving their stuff from their past in order to hang on to their identity.
Yeah.
And so here are two cases, and I'm not sure, just want to know whether they're problems for your theory or not. So the first is the earliest collections in Europe, I think the sort of forerunners of museums go back to the 1500s, maybe the late 1400s even. But one thing about those collections is that the objects are not presented as if they belong to past eras. There's no relationship to the past. It's just a lot of interesting stuff. So is that a challenge to the idea that it's about preserving the past? And the second is that it seems to me that if you look at the great European or northern, sort of global north collections in the United States and elsewhere, that it's very, very important to the meaning of those collections. A lot of the stuff isn't ours. So the fact that there's Assyrian stuff and Egyptian stuff and whatever in the British Museum, it's like saying there's no corner of the past, there's no corner of global culture that Britain doesn't own. But symbolizing that ownership of everything it's very important that that stuff is not our stuff. I mean, the little bit of museums which have British stuff or the history of British painting or artifacts from the Napoleonic Wars or whatever it might be have a totally different meaning to putting Assyrian stuff in the museum, because that's taking possession of somebody else's things. So I just wondered whether they fitted or whether they're not a fit.
I would say that although yes, like I see what you're saying about how, you know, they're not being, you know, British stuff, right? But at the same time, they're very much involved in a project of constructing a certain kind of national identity, right? Like that's part of why they're there, right? So like the Encyclopedic Museum project and the Imperial project are like very much bound up with each other. So it's a way in which the construction of identity, right, is predicated on like consuming the other, right? So there is like the othering, but it's also part of this identity building project. So I would say that what I was saying about the relationship between conservation and identity still holds in that case. It's just got this this bit of complexity built into it. Yeah.
What about the past?
Right. So I think we can sort of take different approaches there, right? So in one way, we might think about the preservation of objects from the distant past, right, where we're sort of not thinking about them in their original context, as still involved in a kind of identity building project in the current time, right? Because it can be a way of like linking a nation or people with the past, right? Even if it's not sort of being treated in its kind of more historically situated context. You know, I mean, I think some museums, and certainly, you know, if you sort of study, you know, these periods of history in university, right, you are going to learn more about the role that these objects played, right, in the life of a particular people. And in those kinds of contexts, I think, you know, what seems different is that, like, obviously because of the passage of time, like they're not the ones doing the conserving, right? We're the ones doing the conserving. So it's not the same kind of like relationship between conservation and identity that you get, right, when you're thinking about the first set of cases, like the sort of the nation building thing. But you could still see the sort of the contextual conservation of, you know, objects from the 15th century or something, as a way of like maintaining a sense of like the identity of that time, right? Not our identity, right? But like one that's removed from ours, so that we can sort of understand, you know, what was it like to live in that time, or something of that.
So it's like the museum of museums or something.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your questions and your participation. Let's thank Erich once more for a fascinating lecture.
Thank you.